We're going to take a look at some of the best websites for finding your Jewish roots online. And here to tell us more about it is Shindelman Kowitt. Now, she's the director of Jewishgen's USA Research Division, and she's the national vice chair of a DAR Specialty Research Jewish Task Force. And she's also the author of the article, Find Your Jewish Roots Online, and it's featured in the May 2021 issue of Family Tree magazine. Welcome to the show, Ellen.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm happy to be here.
Really happy to have you here. This was a terrific article. I mean, so many wonderful resources. And, I was thinking, when I think of Jewish genealogy, immediately my mind goes to jewishgen.org.
Sure.
And I was hoping maybe you could just start us off with an overview of that, because I know that you're involved with them, and boy, do they have a lot to offer.
Yeah, so Jewishgen is really the premier main source for Jewish records on the internet today. It's run as a nonprofit. It's actually a part of a museum on the lower side of Manhattan called the Museum of Jewish Living Heritage. And it's run by a professional executive director, Avraham Grohl, but then there are thousands of volunteers that participate as research division directors who help to identify records, index records, translate records, because language is a big issue in researching Jewish genealogy. And they've developed some really great data sets that can be searched for free by anyone. There's no charge to search Jewishgen. Similar to Family Search, they ask that you register for a username and a password, but they don't sell your name. It's not going to go anywhere past accessing that website. And then they have different tools they've developed that are unique to searching Jewish records. So I think there are a lot of entry points into Jewishgen, and for a novice, particularly beginners who've done not a lot of research anywhere on the internet, it can be a little overwhelming. They have a unified search, which kind of combines the data sets from hundreds of records into one search function, because you can search each of these data sets separately. But if you're just browsing or curious and you just want to throw your names in, the unified search is a great place to start. And something that's really exciting about it is that they've had these special algorithms developed that are unique to Jewish names and Jewish languages. And I'll mention the Jewish languages in a minute, but it's similar to like the National Archives in the United States developed what we call the Soundex, which is an alphanumeric code assigned to your name to help you navigate perhaps other spellings to your name that are similar, but maybe your family didn't spell it that way, but it could be found in a record that way. Well, the American Soundex doesn't always work on Jewish or mostly Eastern European names. So these special Soundexes were developed on Jewishgen and are now used throughout the Jewish genealogy world on other databases as well. One is called the Deutsch Mokotov, another is called the Bader Morse, but Jewishgen doesn't call them that. When you go in, it's blind to you. You'll put your name or your town name into the search engine. There's a form with fields that you can populate, and it doesn't matter if you're spelling the names of your given name or your surname or your town name even correctly, because you're going to be able to pick a couple of different ways to search in a drop-down menu. So the first one will be called sounds like. Second is phonetically like. And then it goes into starts with, is exactly, fuzzy match, fuzzier match, and fuzziest match. My recommendation is always search on sounds like and phonetically like, because those are the Deutsch Mokotov and Bader Morse Jewish algorithms for Jewish names and places. So that's really helpful. Many, many times people coming to Jewish genealogy are just hung up on names and where they come from and figuring out an immigrant's place of origin, because think about it, nobody spoke English in the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is where a majority of Jews came from after 1880. So they're speaking languages like German and Russian and Lithuanian and Polish and even Yiddish, which is linguistically more like a German, although it's written with Hebrew letters. So these immigrants come to American ports, and there could be an immigrant from another part of the world with a different kind of accent, like an Irishman. So an Irishman in America listening to a Yiddish speaker from Russia, of course they're going to butcher spelling the names. It's just par for the course.
Yeah.
So people can't get hung up on the spellings of Jewish names, particularly the surnames and the towns of origin where they're immigrating from. And of course, those towns are important to eventually narrow down and understand where they were, because that's where you're going to look for the records. And that's a second point about Jewishgen that's so helpful. They have a communities database that lists, I think, over 6,000 places where Jews mostly lived in the largest populations around Eastern Europe. And in many of those places, Jews don't live there anymore, but they'll outline for you during different time periods where the records are or where they were. So like a part of what we always refer to Jews coming from Russia, because we see that on passenger manifests or census records. But a lot of times when you see Russia as a place of origin for a Jewish family, if they came before 1917, that was Russian Empire. Russian Empire doesn't exist anymore. And what was the Russian Empire pre-1795 is not Russia proper today. So there are a lot of countries where your family could have come from, including Poland, because part of Poland was in the Russian Empire, that your family might actually be from Lithuania or Latvia or Belarus or Ukraine, or even some places in the south that don't exist anymore. There used to be an area referred to as Bessarabia and another one of Bukovina. These don't exist anymore. Even Prussia, when you talk about the German Jews who came over, and this is true for non-Jews coming from Prussia too, there's no Prussian Empire anymore. And what was the Prussian Empire is now largely Poland, parts of Russia, Germany, of course. But it's misleading that if your family spoke German and said they were Prussian, that they were German the way we think of Germany today. And a lot of Jews came from Prussia, so that's why I mention it. So those are kind of the key things about Jewishgen. It helps you with the name complications and determining what other spellings there might be in records. It also helps you with locating these towns and what the administrative districts today would be. And then the other thing that I would say is networking. So like on Ancestry, there are Jewish message roots boards, like there are for a lot of topics. And Family Search has done a great job with updating their Jewish wiki. And so, and lots of records on these other commercial sites and other nonprofit sites for Jews. I guess I should back up and say, if you're researching a Jewish family, it's no different than any other American family if you're starting in America. You know, you start with the civil records, you start with the vital records and the census records and the passenger manifests. None of these American records are divided by faith or ethnic group. So a Jewish person, or if you're researching a Jewish branch, should be starting the same way as any other American starting their research. Start with yourself, work backwards, go through and exhaust all of the American records that you can, which will help you to determine what those original names and places they came from are. And that's where Jewishgen really helps you. It's kind of like a 102 class. You have to do the American 101 records. And then when you've exhausted all of that, you jump to the Jewish records, which are largely available through Jewishgen. And then the big point about Jewishgen at that point is the networking, because there's this huge discussion group. They're now on Facebook with a group. They have something called the Jewishgen Family Finder, where you can register the names you're looking for and or the towns. And likewise, you can search to see whom else is researching the same names and towns that you are. And through the messaging on Jewishgen, you can get in touch with them and say, hey, this is my story. Can I see your tree? Or do you have any family photos? Or have you had any success finding records for this little town in the middle of Ukraine? Or even have you hired a researcher that was helpful in pushing your research back in this particular archive in Lithuania? And it's a fantastic way to just find people researching the same obscure small areas of the world that you are.
That's an amazing resource. And you're so right about we still have to follow the basic genealogy methodology. We need to go through those records here. And it's tempting. I think people will say, oh, well, I know they were Jewish, so they'll want to jump into that. And yet you miss so many clues that probably would come in super handy once you get over to Jewishgen and you're ready for that.
Absolutely. And I find that people who come to Jewish genealogy as beginners have not done that. And so I'm often backtracking and teaching American research before I ever get to a single Jewish record. So I think it's just really important that people take a look at, and if they're not in the United States and they're listening, Canadian records or British records, wherever you might be starting from, you need to start in the country where your person you're researching is located at those records first.
That's a great point. And I know for my own Sparowskis, who were German East Prussians, really they're out of Belarus. And I'm pretty sure that even though my great-grandfather later was going to the Lutheran Church in America, I think they were a Jewish family back in Belarus in the time. And Jewishgen has been one of the few places to find information about some of these locations that have changed names and boundaries and all those things. It's just an amazing resource in that way.
Sure, and Belarus is a good example. Jewishgen has a number, maybe over 20 research divisions. I happen to be the director for what's called the USA Research Division. And just to define that, it's not census records and passenger manifests. It's looking at records held at Jewish repositories that are in the US, like the American Jewish Archives or the Southern Jewish Historical Society or something like that. But yeah, there are research divisions geographically all throughout Eastern Europe, and there's one for Belarus called the Belarus Research Division. And if you click on their link from Jewishgen's drop-down menu, they have their own website, and they give a lot of maps now and then of what Belarus was, and lists of towns divided by like province or what was gubernia. And there are ways to connect with people and search what their records are. And here's a little tip I have about research divisions and any project on Jewishgen. If you don't find what you're looking for and you really think it might be there, or you're spelling it wrong and it's not showing up in the Soundex, contact whoever the person is on that record set, or who the research division director is, or who the town leader is. Like in Ukraine, there are hundreds of town leaders for these little towns. And what we find is that the town leaders and the research division leaders often know or are holding onto records that are not online. And so if you're not finding something, it's free to send an email. Just inquire and say, do you know anything else about Grodno, Belarus in 1854, or the name Cohen, or whatever it is. And you just never know what these folks have, because I have found there are a lot of offline lists that the experts know about.
That's very good insider information. That's wonderful. And it's true. I mean, as you go into your genealogy research, don't you just more and more just get a little more daring and go ahead and send that email? All they can do is just not be available or whatever, but it sounds like those folks are more than happy to help. So what a wonderful idea. Now, you mentioned we were talking about specific regions, and I'm sure there's all kinds of different things here. What other types of websites might be out there for regional Jewish genealogy?
Yeah, so it's a little confusing. There's a kind of a hierarchy. It's not coordinated by any like organizing body, but there are 3 independently run Jewish database sites. And when I say the names, sometimes people say, oh, well, that's a part of Jewishgen. They're not. They're run independently. Okay. So the 3 are JRI Poland, which stands for Jewish Records Indexing Poland, Gesher Galicia, and I'll define that area for you, and what we used to call LitvakSIG, and a SIG stands for Special Interest Group. So all 3 of these groups kind of had roots in Jewishgen, and then for different organizing reasons, all wanted to organize as independent nonprofits. but they share their data. Now, do they share all of their data? Do they share their data at the same time? Are they sharing it in the same place? The answers really vary. So this is why I always say, if you're brand new, check out the unified search on Jewishgen. Ancestry actually has some of LitvakSIG, some of JRI Poland, and some of Jewishgen's records. And just recently, LitvakSIG released some of their records to MyHeritage. So there's some overlap back and forth on the data sets. But if you're from these three particular geographic regions, I wouldn't only be looking on Ancestry, Family Search, and Jewishgen. I would always go to the original databases on each of their original websites. So LitvakSIG really stands for Lithuania, but Lithuania today is different than the geographic borders of Lithuania 100 years ago. So when you look at modern day Lithuania on a map, if your family's coming from a part of Latvia or Belarus or an area of Russia, just kind of that surrounds that area, you might want to look there. I have this corner of southwestern Lithuania that part of my family came from, but it has also been Prussian, it has been Suwalki, Poland, and it's right near Belarus, but yet I found records in Lithuania and LitvakSIG. I've also found them in Suwalki for JRI Poland. So loosely, when you define your location, consider what's geographically around the modern day borders. But LitvakSIG is predominantly Lithuania, and a lot of Jews came from Vilnius and Kaunas and all these places up there. The second one is JRI Poland. So this group, they're fantastic in their records acquisition. They've had partnerships with the Polish State Archives. They give locations of microfilm that are for Polish municipalities at the Family Search digital collection. And they have tons of volunteers who've worked for 30 years. So it's extremely extensive. For listeners that don't know, the Polish State Archives has largely gone online. So a lot of vital records are digitized and you can go right to the record. Now it may be in Polish or Russian, but you can get to those records for free, just like you can on Family Search sometimes. So JRI Poland is just a powerhouse for getting access, using their indexes first to locate if there are records for your family in a town, using the soundexes that are the Jewish soundexes, and then getting to the original record. So I just love JRI Poland, and be loose on those borders because it's going to include Suwalki and those areas north on the Lithuanian-Russian border, even the Belarus border, that Prussian border on the other side. So for JRI Poland, cast a broad net of areas that were ever considered Poland, even on the southern side too. And then the third one is called Gesher Galicia, also run independently, also shares data with Jewishgen. Galicia does not exist anymore. It was a designation for an area what today you would think of on a map as Western Ukraine and Eastern Poland. And a lot of Jews lived in Galicia. Unique to that area is that it was Austro-Hungarian Empire at one point, so the records are in German, not so much in Russian or in Polish. But Gesher Galicia's got a fantastic search engine on their database, and they're another powerhouse, just continuing with their volunteer army of adding so many great data sets. They're really good too at allowing you to list what towns you're researching if you join, and I think they have a small membership fee. In fact, each of them have a membership fee that they've added on, and I think that just gives you access to records maybe a little bit sooner. But these three often lumped in with Jewishgen, but really organized as separate organizations, and they acquire records and index them in a different way.
That's a great overview. And it reminds us, I think it's kind of like with all genealogy, isn't it? It's like when you see partners working together and they end up with records on multiple sites, I find myself, I want to look at those records, even if they're the same on every site, because you never know what the nuances are. You never know if their image is clearer. I mean, there's so many different possible variations, aren't there?
There are. And like, I've taken a deep dive on Ancestry's records of Jewishgen. They started an arrangement a while back now, I think in 2008. And so Jewishgen gave them a bunch of records in return for Ancestry housing their servers. So a great business arrangement for a little nonprofit like Jewishgen,
Right.
but confusing, I think, for people who either, there are researchers who only use Ancestry and, they never look any further. Certainly, if you're finding things on Ancestry that are Jewishgen, you want to go to Jewishgen and search also, because Jewishgen has not updated all of the records that they sent to Ancestry 10 or more years ago. There are unique records that were never sent to Ancestry, and you pick up those Jewish Soundex search capacities on Jewishgen. Now, Ancestry search has definitely advanced in recent years, but it's not, what do we call it? The Bader-Morse or the Dach-Mokotov Jewish algorithms for searching Jewish names. So if you can't find somebody on the Jewishgen collection at Ancestry, go to Jewishgen and try running the search there.
Great advice. Oh gosh. Okay. Now another area I can think of as a roadblock area for folks in their research is around the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So what kinds of resources do we have to conduct research when it comes to the Holocaust?
So it used to be, I started doing this about 25 years ago, and either the records were not released by some of the archives in Russia or in the East, or they weren't in English, or they weren't indexed. And so you would put in these requests and it would take literally years for certain repositories to answer just a basic inquiry, yes or no, we have a card on your family.
Right.
And I think there was a lot of mythology built around, you can't document the Holocaust and what happened to people. And what we're finding all these years later is there are so many records. Plenty of people are documenting their families. We are continuing to find more resources available online, even from repositories that are traditionally not in English. It's hard to say where to start because the story of the Holocaust has also evolved. It used to be we'd learn in school, if we even learned at all about the story of the Holocaust, that it was the story of the concentration camps and the Jews being gassed. And that's certainly true. But there's so many other elements of the Holocaust, like the story of the 1.5 million Jews killed in Ukraine before anyone ever was killed at Auschwitz. We call this the Holocaust by bullets. And the story in most of what was the Soviet Union at that time was that Jews were rounded up and this is gruesome, but they were executed and left in mass graves that are unmarked largely throughout what was the Soviet Union. And so even Jews who knew their family were tied up in those kind of stories thought there's no way to figure out what happened or where, what happened to my family or the town.
Right.
But we do have records. The Russians kept records. It turns out the Germans kept records. And a lot of this has become available online that you can search in English. So it really depends for a family that knows they have a Holocaust story, where they were, what country they were originated in. If you know the story that they went to a camp or if they were in a small town where there was a mass grave, you're going to be looking at very different resources. I would say if you only had to look at one and you wanted to just start this process, YadVashem in Israel's website in English would be the place to do a general top level search. And the reason is because YadVashem is like the version of, we have the US Holocaust Museum in DC and they have resources too. But the one in Israel is called YadVashem and it's got a larger collection. And they've also collected these pages of testimony from survivors who talk about their family members and where they last saw them, or if they know the exact story about what happened to them or their whereabouts throughout the war. And thousands of these pages have been submitted and they're searchable. And you can see the original pages that people submit, and you can even get in contact with the people submitting them. So it's a great networking opportunity for people looking to connect. And YadVashem even has these great success stories, less and less because the survivors are aging out, but where they connected people who still had living relatives, in Argentina and Australia or in Europe. And they're just fantastic, renewal stories. But yeah, complicated topic. It is possible to learn what happened to a community, hopefully to an individual. Records are at Bad Arolsen, the Arolsen Archives in Germany, in addition to Yad Vashem, in addition to the US Holocaust Museum. Jewishgen does have a Holocaust collection worth searching, although it's smaller than these other larger repositories. And there are all kinds of things on the internet, webinars and speakers, and even books that have been published on how to track down victims and survivors of the Holocaust, and non-Jewish too. Like, I know a lot of the work camps. I recently was looking into someone who came from a Ukrainian Orthodox family, and they were shipped out of Ukraine to what would be now the Czech Republic. They were in a work camp. So sometimes these repositories you think of as Jewish record repositories for Jews in the Holocaust also tell the story of the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have all those resources that you've been mentioning in the show notes. And I just so appreciate, your vast knowledge on this. Ellen, I know you teach people about genealogy, Jewish genealogy. Tell us a little bit, how did you get started into genealogy and then into it professionally?
I guess like everybody out there, I just have that gene. Even from a young age, I was the one who just gobbled up the stories at the holiday tables and remembered the names and connected the relationships and just kept track of it in my head long before I realized that was not normal. It was unusual. Not everyone does that. And then I think in my 20s, I got, there's a woman, Sally Ann Sack, who writes a lot of books on Jewish genealogy. And she's one of the publishers of Avotenu, which is both a journal on Jewish genealogy, but also a publishing company on books about Jewish genealogy. And I happened to go to a lecture she gave at a synagogue in Washington, D.C., 25 or more years ago. And she said, hey, we have this club. It's a Jewish genealogy society. We're doing a beginner's workshop. Do you want to come? And I went. And there was no looking back. I just got the bug, started interviewing relatives like we all are taught to talk to the oldest people first. The records can wait. And it just went from there. And I got super involved as a volunteer. I actually think volunteering is a great way when you're a beginner to learn about record sets. I have seen probate records and naturalizations and Jewish records that I would never have found in my own family by helping index through a project with a local society. And that was fascinating to me. So I just kept going and going, doing my own, doing volunteer. And then one day a friend insisted on paying me money to do some research on his mother. And I actually liked it. And I thought, wow, if I can make a few extra dollars to pay for my genealogy obsession, these websites can be expensive, the conferences cost money, but if I can make money and help to pay for my obsession, then I'm going to be a professional. So that's kind of how I fell into that, and it's grown from there.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think those of us who kind of somehow caught the bug when we were younger, we were really fortunate because we got opportunities and I think had a focus on talking to and recording some of those stories. I know that's probably people's biggest regret is when they didn't think about it back when they had an opportunity to interview some of the older relatives. And I know in my case, I just treasure the few interviews that I did do and I still have.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing all these wonderful resources and the article, wonderful article, Find Your Jewish Roots, online in the May-June 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Ellen, it's been a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Ellen Kowitt for joining us here today. You can learn more about her at ellenkowitt.com, KOWITT.com. And of course, you can read her article, Find Your Jewish Roots, online in the May 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Be sure and check out the show notes. We've got all the details on everything that we talked about in this episode. Thanks again for watching. I'll talk to you soon.